Hello everyone! Thanks for joining us again today for our chapter book story time here at the Caribou Public Library. I'm Miss Erin, and we are going to be continuing to read Little Britches by Ralph Moody, the story of him and his family as he was growing up on a ranch in Wyoming. All right, so we are in the second half of chapter 24 today. If you remember from the first half that Ralph has been able to go and learn how to ride on cows and be a cowpoke. His friend Hi, the cowboy, is there as well. And here at the end of where we stopped, Hi is going to gentle break the colt that Ralph should learn to ride. All right, here we are. I had seen Father gentle break a couple of horses and expected to see Hi go at it the same way, but he didn't. Instead of putting his rope on the blue colt, he tossed it on his own blue, led him out of the corral, and saddled him. When he rode back in, he was holding a short loop on the off side of his saddle, not swinging it the way the other fellows did when they were after a horse. The remuda circled the corral, but Hi didn't follow them. He held his blue quiet near the center until they bunched in a corner. Then he moved toward them at a slow walk. When they broke, his rope flipped out and settled around the roan colt's neck, the way the tongue of a toad flips out at a fly. I was watching like a hawk, and I never saw him give his horse the least bit of a sign. But as the blue colt raced out of the fence corner, Hi's blue was right beside him. He was snubbed to the saddle horn with no more than 4 feet of rope, but there was no jerk on his neck as Hi drew him away from the remuda and into the center of the corral. For just 1 second, the colt stood trembling. Then he seemed to explode, striking at the taut rope with his 4 hooves and thrashing his head and trying to shake it loose. My fingernails were digging into one of the corral poles, and I was shaking all over, but Hi seemed as calm as if he had a kitten on a string. His blue circled and moved away, keeping the line snug on the colt's neck, while Hi easy-talked him. I must have held the blue colt there in the middle of the corral for 10 minutes. He kept talking to him all the time, as his own blue danced in a circle with the colt thrashing around them. I couldn't make out a word that Hi was saying, but his voice sounded like water running over stones in a brook. The roan was ringing wet, but he had stopped striking. He motioned with his hand, and Ted Eberts swung the gate into the breaking corral open, then stepped away from it. Hi's blue changed the direction of his dance until the colt had been led through the gate without seeming to realize it. When Ted closed the gate and started toward them with a saddle in his hand, the colt went crazy all over again. Mr. Cooper was standing down the fence a ways from where I was. After the colt quieted down a little, he called to Hi, "Ain't you seen enough yet to know that Maverick will never be a kid's horse?" He didn't lift his voice a bit, but he said, "No, I ain't. And you ain't seen the kid ride. You got 2 surprises coming." I liked to hear Hi say that, and I made up my mind that I was going to ride that blue roan if it killed me. But I was really awfully scared. I held my hands tight in the mill so nobody would see how they were shaking, and tried to think of things that Father had told me that might make them be still. As they had moved into the breaking corral from the big one, Hi had shortened the snub rope until the colt's head was pulled to within less than a foot of his saddle horn. He slid from the far side of his horse, dropped his reins, and came around to where Ted was waiting with the saddle. His roan stopped dancing the minute he dropped the reins and stood as still as a snubbing post. The blue colt crowded against him and stood trembling as Hi came slowly toward them with the saddle held chest high. He was still talking like water running over stones when he eased it over the colt's back. Hi worked his hand up along the blue colt's neck as Ted moved in closer and passed him a hackamore. He slipped it around the colt's neck and over his nose as Ted tightened the saddle cinch and knotted it. White was showing around the blue's eyes, and every muscle under his dripping hide was pulled tight. He looked as though he might explode any second, but both men worked without a quick move anywhere. My chest hurt, and I realized that I was holding my breath. Ted loosened the lasso as Hi passed the hackamore rope through the loop, bent and took off his spurs. Then Hi hitched up his belt, wrapped the hackamore rope around his hand, and eased into the saddle. When he nodded, Ted slipped off the lariat and jumped clear. The roan colt stood for maybe 10 seconds as though he were cut out of stone, and Hi just sat still. Then the colt shot off as if a trigger had been pulled somewhere inside of him. I thought Prince could buck, and that I could ride a bronco, but it was only because I didn't know any better. The blue didn't buck straight out. He didn't spin or circle. His first leap took his front hooves 10 feet off the ground, and they came down like pile drivers. He bounced to the right, smashed down, snapped to the left, and went up again like a geyser. His hindquarters didn't follow his fores, but snaked around like a bucking bull's. All the blood seemed to have drained out of me and left me dry as prairie dust. My eyes burned and my tongue stuck to the top of my mouth. The roan crashed against the poles at the far end of the corral, in the side swipe, pivoted, and rushed across the ring. He had changed his stride to a chop, and Hi's head was snapping like a ball on a string. It wasn't until then that I noticed he wasn't raking or fanning the roan, just pulling against the horse's bogged head with the hackamore rope and holding himself tight up against the pommel. The colt was plunging right toward me. Hi saw me just when I was ready to jump and waved his free arm as the blue jackknifed back toward the center of the ring. Nothing alive could have stood that pace long, so it probably wasn't more than a minute before the roan rocketed, crashed down, and stood trembling. Hi's face and neck were swollen and so red that they looked as though they might break into flames, but he didn't seem a bit afraid. He stroked the colt's neck and talked to him. His voice hadn't changed a mite from the way it sounded before he got on. Sweat dripped off the roan like rain from the eaves of a house, and his sides pumped in and out like a bellows. I could see the whites showing round his eyes, and it was a look of fright, not of meanness. None of the men on the fence made a sound as the horse seemed to be making up his mind whether to start all over again or to relax. I watched the quiver in his withers grow less and less, and then he moved a foot forward. The saddle squeaked, and he spooked, but he didn't buck. Then he took another step, and another. Neither Hi nor any man on the fence moved as the colt made a nervous circle of the corral. After a couple of rounds, Hi motioned to Mr. Cooper to open the outside gate. The colt shot through the opening, round the big corral, and away across the hayfield. Hi had a short hold on the hackamore rope and was holding the blue's head up to keep him out of another buck. It might have been 10 minutes before they came back, and it was easy to see that there had been an understanding between Hi and the colt. He spooked a little and shied off from the corral gate, but Hi let him take his time, and he sidled back through. When the gate was closed, Hi slipped out of the saddle and loosened the cinches. He must have had the rest of it all planned out with Ted Eberts, because Ted went in and took the saddle to the barn. When he came back, he was carrying mine and laid it by the gate. I was still afraid, but nothing like I had been before, and I knew it was my time to ride. So I climbed down and picked up my saddle. Mr. Cooper took it from me and told me to stay outside until it was on. He asked me if I was scared, and I lied to him. I said no, not one bit, but I was shaking inside. I never knew a horse could buck like that blue, and I knew I'd go off at the first thud if he did it again. I wasn't so much afraid of falling off outside where a horse could run away, but it seemed as though I would surely get trampled if I went off in that little corral. Hi gentle talked the roan colt and stroked his head while Mr. Cooper and Ted cinched my saddle onto him. Then he motioned to me to climb up on the fence beside them. He told me the colt would buck again with a new rider, but not so hard. Not so hard as he had seen Prince buck with me. He told me not to be afraid, but to keep myself pulled up tight against the pommel with the hackamore rope, and to keep my eyes on the roan's ears, so I would know which way he was fixin' to jump. After that, he got on his own horse and saddled the colt over against the fence. I noticed that all the other fellows had spaced themselves round the corral with their ropes shaken out. It made me feel a lot safer as I eased myself down into my new saddle. When I was set, Hi wheeled his horse away. Ted and Mr. Cooper jumped back, and I was on my own. The colt bogged his head, leaped, and thudded down. From there on, I don't know much about it except what they told me afterwards. But I do know that he didn't buck the way he did with Hi, or I'd have gone flying. When it was over, Hi came riding in to take me off, but I didn't want him to. I was so dizzy I could only see a blur, and I couldn't make words come out of my mouth. Maybe it was so because I had bitten my tongue, but I don't think so. I think it was because I was still too scared, and too happy because I hadn't fallen off. I knew what I wanted, though, he said. You're damn right you're going to get to ride him. Open the gate, Len. His blue never left my side more than 3 feet, all the way across the alfalfa field, out over a strip of prairie, and back to the corral. On the way back, the colt wasn't fighting. I could feel the smooth power of his muscles under the saddle, and I knew that he was going to be my horse. He had bucked harder with me than the fellows expected him to. I don't know how I stayed on. I guess I was just too scared to fall off. Anyway, Mr. Cooper shook hands with me after and high lifted me down. He said, "By God, you're going to make a cowpoke, Little Britches. As long as you're with me, you can call him your own horse." Then he laughed and he said to the other men, "I thought that the kid was going to pull that 1-inch hackamore rope in two before the music stopped." Father never swore, and I know I'd never have said it out loud. But before I really knew what I was thinking, "By God, I thought so too," went through my head. Well, that is the end of chapter 24. Hope you guys enjoyed the reading for today, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.